Margaret Barker. Where's Margaret? Margaret. Yes. Margaret is a biblical scholar who specializes in developing for the last 12 years since her affiliation with Religion, Science, and Environment, a theology for creation. And she has a new book coming out next month called Creation, A Biblical Vision for the Environment. Please welcome Margaret Barker.
First of all, I apologize for sitting down there, but like all biblical scholars, I find bright lights rather difficult. We prefer a little gloom. Now, Your Holiness, sisters, brothers, what follows is a personal reflection from someone who has worked for many years within the community of biblical scholars. And this is a very interesting question. Can religion help save the planet? In the Bible-based church where I was brought up, religion was about saving me, not the planet. And it was a long time before I realized that there was more to Christianity than just saving me. Perhaps this is the first place where, as the title of our symposium suggests, we need to restore balance. And in many churches, this is now happening. Religion, any religion, shapes the worldview of those who commit themselves to it. And my worldview was shaped by the Bible as I had learned it in my church school, as I had heard it preached in church each Sunday. There are many Christians, particularly of my background, which we call Bible-based, who can tell the same story. I learned about God creating the world, that Adam was made in the image of God, that Adam was commanded to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it, to have dominion over every living creature. For centuries, the Hebrew text was translated in this way and was understood, with some pride, as a description of Adam's power over the creation. He was its ruler, with a God-given duty to raise numerous children and the right to use the resources of the earth which had been given to him. And Adam, of course, represented all human beings. I also learned about the great covenants with Abraham, with Moses, and with David. And I learned about the new covenant. And then I went on to further study of the Bible, and I learned that the Old Testament was the history of the chosen people, and the New Testament was about my personal salvation. This is another area where we need to restore balance. I, and many others like me, had been given only half the story. Creation, Adam and Eve, Abraham, Moses, David, the other great heroes of the Bible, then the story of Jesus and his disciples and how the church spread out from Jerusalem. How was any of this relevant to the care of creation? Anyone who has ever had to preach about the care of creation and to find a New Testament text knows there is very little. Consider the lilies of the field will not do, because it is not about creation care, it is about trust in God to provide for us. To restore a balanced picture of what the Bible teaches, we need to use the whole Bible and to rediscover its vision of creation. The Bible does have a beautiful and sophisticated account of the creation and the role of human beings. But this is not set out in a single text, and certainly not just in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. It has to be recovered from the whole of the Old Testament, from the poetry of the prophets and the sayings of the sages, from the rituals of the priests and the parables of the storytellers, And since the New Testament shares this view of the creation, it is the basis for Christian belief about the environment. But all this has been neglected, and the balance in biblical study must be restored. For many years, biblical scholars emphasized the Bible as history. It was the title, you may recall, some of you, very popular book. Syllabuses in schools and colleges made students learn about the kings and heroes of ancient Israel, illustrated by exciting archaeological finds. And there were all those wonderful television programs. The great concept of the covenant was presented only in historical and political terms, and we spent many, many years looking for its origin among the ancient Hittites and came to no conclusion. Looking back now at the books that were the standard text for students, they seem to have had an underlying fear of any talk about creation apart from Genesis. Fear that somehow this was tainted with fertility cults. The religion of the Old Testament was defined and presented as history, albeit salvation history, and the creation elements were identified as a foreign influence. There were other voices, but very few and largely ignored. Much Protestant biblical scholarship is still under the influence of the Enlightenment, which I think is an unfortunate term, with the rejection of any idea of divine revelation, and for biblical scholars, the development of what we call the historical critical method, which still dominates the field. Johann Gabler's famous lecture in 1787 marked the parting of the ways. Biblical theology, he said, had to be a purely historical discipline, assembling the opinions of the various writers of the Bible. Thus it was that when people began to be aware of the environmental crisis, Bible-based churches didn't have enough resources to teach about the creation. Biblical scholars simply had not been writing about it. Furthermore, many biblical scholars didn't consider that their work needed to have any relevance or use to Christian communities. You may find that surprising, but it is true. If you work in the field of biblical scholarship, certainly where I work, if you have a faith position, this is regarded as a bias, and therefore what you produce is likely to be suspect. 40 years ago, the late Bishop Hugh Montefiore, who was a founder member of this symposium, said, "It is small wonder that theology is regarded by so many as irrelevant if it does not concern itself with the real world in which we all live." About 40 years ago, too, as people became aware of the state of the environment, the story of Adam and his role became an accusation against the churches. Adam's claim to special status as ruler of the earth, it was said, had caused the imminent crisis, and it was Christians, especially Protestant Christians, who had taught human beings that they had the right and even the duty to use the earth as they saw fit. To save the earth, the critics argued, human beings would have to change how they thought of themselves. They were only a part of the creation, part of the system, and had no special status or claim upon the creation. Now, the dominion of Adam is indeed central to the biblical picture of human life, as is the belief that human beings are more than just animals. But here, the original Hebrew words in Genesis need to be carefully scrutinized. The first Christians described Jesus as the new Adam, the second Adam. But they had a very different idea of Adam's intended role in the creation and how he ruled when they claimed this for Jesus. Some of the recent proposals for understanding Adam, such as Adam, the steward of creation, This is an idea that has been imported into the biblical text. It is quite alien to it. Or Adam the earth keeper are useful for teaching, but they would have been unfamiliar to the first Christians. If we can bring back into current discourse something of the biblical vision for creation as the first Christians knew it, something of their belief about Adam and the intended role for human beings, then Bible-based Christianity can do a lot to shape a way of thinking and living that could help save the planet. So I give you just a couple of examples. First, the covenant, which is a basic idea that takes many forms in the Bible, the covenant with Abraham, with Moses, with David. The most fundamental form, however, has been almost completely neglected. And so here is another area where we need to restore balance. The first covenant mentioned in the Bible, in the story of Noah, is the everlasting covenant, the covenant with every living creature. Elsewhere, this is called the covenant of peace, the covenant of wholeness and integrity. And this idea of covenant underlies the whole biblical worldview. They imagine the everlasting covenant as a system of bonds to keep the whole creation in one and bind it to the Creator, the source of its life. Sin, by definition, was anything that broke a covenant bond. And the word that the Bible often translates, the English Bible translates as iniquity, means literally distortion. If too many bonds were broken or distorted, the whole system would collapse. This is the origin of those terrifying pictures in the apocalypse, the stars falling, mountains moving, the sky rolled up like a scroll. Those are 3 examples from the book of Revelation. And today we have been thinking about how all things are interconnected. This is what the Bible means when it talks about the everlasting covenant. Human sin could destroy the creation. And from its very beginning, this symposium has said that harming the environment is a sin, a position deeply rooted in this neglected aspect of the covenant. And second, what of Adam's role? The description in Genesis that Adam was to subdue the earth and have dominion over every living thing described Adam before his disobedience, before he had chosen to do things his own way. And so those words, translated that way and taken out of context, have indeed contributed to the present state of crisis. But how were they understood by the first Christians when they proclaimed Jesus as the new Adam? So focus on just one word. This is the word which is usually translated subdue. The most common meaning when this verb is used for human beings is that they subdue or bind or harness. But when it is used of the Lord, it has a different, though related sense. It means to bind up in the sense of to heal and restore. An example from the prophet Micah. The prophet Micah said that the Lord delights in love, he has compassion on us, and binds up our distortions. A curious phrase. Love and compassion do not fit well with the idea of subjection. Since Adam was created as the image of God, he was created to act with love and compassion and to bind up the distortions, whatever was threatening the everlasting covenant. Adam was created to keep the bonds secure. One of the earliest Christian hymns, quoted by St. Paul when he was writing to the church at Colossae, describes Jesus as the new Adam. He is the image of the invisible God. That's Adam. The firstborn of all creation. That's Adam. And in him all things hold together. What else can this mean other than that Adam, the image, was intended to hold all things together to preserve the eternal covenant of creation? So, can religion help save the planet? For a Bible-based Christian, the answer must be yes, but only if we first restore the balance in the way that we read and teach and preach the Bible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Now we're going to have actually just a very short video that will have a selection from Margaret and Bruce Clark, the international news editor of The Economist magazine. And Bruce and Margaret have been making this with a young filmmaker in the UK. So we're ready for this short film, which will reflect on Genesis and pick up some of the points that you have just made, Margaret.
The influence of the book of Genesis, which says, the Lord God said, go forth and multiply to Adam and Eve, and that the natural world is there for you to dominate. You have dominion over the animals and plants of the world. And that basic notion that the world is there for us, and that if it doesn't actually serve our purposes, it's dispensable, that has produced the devastation of vast areas of the land surface.
Man having dominion. Now, the Hebrew word can mean something strong and forceful and subduing, but it can also mean something else. We know that Solomon, this word is used of Solomon, and it says there was peace on all sides. And Solomon's peaceful rule is described with this word. He had this sort of dominion. And we know that in New Testament times, in the time of Jesus, the word was replaced with another word, the word marshal, and that means to rule and hold all things in balance, which is rather different from the idea of having a heavy-handed or indeed a heavy-footed dominion. So we have to be very careful how we're going to translate this. Many times the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages has been determined by the needs of those, or the wishes of those who translated it, in order to be able to use it for other ends.
And many of the theologies that were developed were done from a position of power, where subduing was something that kings did, that rulers did, that the churches did, in line with the Roman Empire, for example. And so the idea of domination was very, very strong and seen as very legitimate. However, if you were on the other side of that power, as liberation theologians have pointed out, if you are subject to that power, when you read words that have been translated subdue, you might actually see them more in terms of stewardship, look after, nurture, those kind of meanings attributed to those words. And actually, that is a better, and I would argue more authentic, reading of the original text, and understanding that the earth is there, which we are in alliance with, which we work with, which we are there to develop and nurture.
So we too are creatures. That's something absolutely basic to Christian faith. The division is between the uncreated God and everything else, and that's us and the concrete and the earthworms and the universe, the lot. And the loss of that Christian sense that we are all God's creatures, that I think is a tremendous danger for the planet and therefore for ourselves.
The Genesis narrative has been the subject of very profound meditations understanding, its reflections in every century of Christian history up to the present day. In fact, the tendency to regard it as a literal scientific narrative is a very, very recent thing indeed.
Origen wrote famously, "Who would be found simple enough to believe that, like some farmer, God planted trees in the Garden of Eden, in the east, and that he planted a tree of life in it, that a visible tree that could be touched, that someone could eat of this tree with corporeal teeth and gain life, and further some other could eat from another tree and receive the knowledge of good and evil." I do not think anyone would doubt that these are figurative expressions which indicate certain mysteries through a semblance of history and not through actual events. Now you might say, well, Origen, fine. Origen was condemned posthumously as a heretic, but you know, Origen was not condemned for everything he did and wrote.
We always think of Adam as the first human being, but it is not a man, it just means the human. And it's how you talk about the human race. Adam is, and the stories about Adam are virtually parables, really. And Adam's partner at this stage is not Eve. Adam's partner is the soil. And so Adam, and then the feminine form of Adam is Adama, which is the soil. And one of the subtle things that the storyteller weaves into the Genesis telling of the tale is that when Adam lost his intended relationship with God, the result was that he lost his intended relationship with the soil. Because when Adam is driven from Eden, we know that the soil becomes dry and barren, thorns and thistles, and he has to toil to extract food from it. Adam the steward is not a biblical concept. That's important, because a lot of that, Adam the steward gives entirely the wrong business relationship. In the time of Jesus, Adam was not the steward, Adam was the high priest.
Male, female, child, whatever, we're all supposed to be priests. If what it means to be a priest isn't to wear a collar and act sanctimonious, but rather what it means to be a priest is to offer to God. That's the supreme priestly moment, is the offering of the world to God. And so that's the universal vocation, is to offer the world to God.
I think when you examine the people who have the ideas of a literal six-day creation, you have to look at their broader theological views as well, and particularly their eschatological views. That's a theological term meaning how they view the end of time, the last things. And a lot of them will look to the other end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, and believe, or their reading of it, is that everything's going to burn, the whole earth is going to be destroyed, and we're all going to go to heaven. So therefore, the job of the Christian is not to care for creation, it's all going to be rubbish anyway. The job of the Christian is essentially to save as many people as possible from a failing planet for eternal life in heaven. Now that, I think, is very bad theology.
Il faut penser le monde à neuf. N'oubliez pas que le récit de la Genèse a été écrit lorsque le peuple juif était en esclavage à Babylone. Phrase magnifique, n'oubliez jamais que le récit de la Genèse est un récit de libération. C'est un récit pour la libération de notre âme. Quand on est en esclavage, quand on est en tristesse, qu'est-ce qui nous libère? Ce qui nous libère, c'est de dire faites du neuf. Pourquoi? Parce que l'esclavage, c'est vieux. Et parce que la tristesse, c'est vieux. Autrement dit, le récit de la Genèse, qui parle de création, est un récit joyeux. C'est un récit jubilatoire. Et c'est comme ça que je vois le Big Bang. Au lieu de me disputer avec mon voisin pour savoir s'il y a eu ou pas un commencement absolu de l'univers, au lieu d'essayer d'avoir raison en cassant la figure à mon adversaire, j'explose de vie, j'explose de bonheur, et qu'est-ce que je vois? Je vois à travers le Big Bang une chose magnifique, l'explosion de joie de Dieu devant l'univers. L'univers est une explosion de joie, derrière la fuite des galaxies.
Thank you. And now we're very privileged to have Patricia Cochran, who has had many roles in the Arctic Circle, but in particular, she is the past chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and she is currently the executive director of the Alaskan Native Science Commission. She chaired the Indigenous Peoples Global Summit on Climate Change, which included 400 Indigenous leaders from over 80 countries. Please join me in welcoming Patricia Cochran.
Waka Qanuitpin, I bring you greetings from the north. Your All Holiness, Excellencies, Your Royal Highness, my brothers and sisters, I thank you very much for once again having the opportunity to come and speak with you. And I promise you, Maria, that I will try to make this just a one Kleenex box necessary for the crowd today. I have been taught in my community to begin everything that I do by first of all giving thanks to the Creator for this beautiful day that has been given to us. I honor the people whose land we are upon today and acknowledge the Indigenous people of this area and thank them for giving us permission to be here on their land. I stop to honor all of my elders who are here with us, and I remember all of our ancestors who have come before us. I want to briefly introduce myself in my own way. My English name is Patricia, but who I am is Sikwana. That is the name that was given to me by my mother and my aunties. It's the name of a young girl who died very early in her life, and I was given the honor and the responsibility of living my life for another human being. It changes who you are when you know that you must live your life for another human being. And I'm always grateful for knowing that is who I am. I would like to talk a little bit. First of all, let me show you my hometown, if you can see my world from where I live. I was born in a town, the furthest northwestern point in Alaska, the community called Nome, Alaska. I live now in Anchorage, but my home, my heart, my soul belongs to my home in Nome, where, by the way, you can actually see Russia from our doorstep. Okay, that's the only comment I'm going to make about our former governor. I'd like to, if I could, just reframe the question just a bit from my own perspective as an Indigenous person. First of all, I'd like to reframe it by asking the question, not can religion help save our planet, but can spirituality help to save our planet? Most of you know that organized religion and Indigenous communities have not always had the best of relationships. I would like to talk to you today about the way that I live my spirituality, the way I practice who I am, and the kinds of things that are important in our communities when we're trying to look at this question. Spirituality to me really means the culture that I come from, the values that are taught to me and have been taught to me by my ancestors from generations in the past. It's the living traditional knowledge and wisdom that comes not only from my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, but as far back as one can remember and as far forward as we are honored to live on this planet. I'd like to just share a few things with you today to talk about some of the experiences that we're seeing in the Arctic, and then also to look at this from more of a global position, a global perspective, because as Indigenous people, we really are taught that all things and all people are connected. So I'd like to show some of those connections to you today. You know, it really has only been a few years ago, in 2004, after the release of the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment Report that our friend Bob was instrumental in, that climate change in the Arctic was just coming into the global consciousness just a few years ago. The long-term projections for the North included an ice-free Arctic Ocean by the summer of 2050 and the loss of our hunting and sharing culture due to climate change. While those forecasts seemed dire at the time, I only wish now that they had been true. We are now in the midst of an historic transformation in the Arctic. In the past year, we have witnessed entire landscapes and icescapes on the move or disappearing. In 2006, the projections for an ice-free Arctic summer were revised down to 2040. And let me just tell you a story about this community. This is off the coast of Barrow, where just this last summer, one morning the people in Barrow woke up to find 400 German tourists in their town. Nobody knew how they got there. Nobody knew they were coming, but there they were. So we know that this ice-free Arctic is truly something that is happening to us every day. We are experiencing it even now. Today, I'm here to share with you some of what the Inuit, as Indigenous peoples, have learned from these great changes. When I say this, I don't mean only what our communities have observed in our changing landscape. I mean to share with you as well, and perhaps more importantly, the wisdom of our people and all Indigenous peoples that we have gained as we adapted over millennia to survive and thrive in diverse environments around the earth, and as we now struggle to adapt to the new challenges of climate change. For decades, we in the Arctic have witnessed the most dramatic environmental effects of globalization. We've weathered the onslaught of POPs, of heavy metals and other contaminants that have been borne north in the winds and the ocean currents. But we now face a new set of changes, which will be even more difficult for us to reverse. In the Arctic, our Indigenous communities are struggling to cope with extreme erosion, with melting permafrost and slumping beaches, with thinning sea ice, receding glaciers, and an invasion of new species of animals. This photograph that I show you here is a community in Alaska called Shishmaref. This village has been there for at least 8,000 years. And now this village, because as you can see, the storms, the erosion, the lack of ice that used to block those storms from coming into our communities is no longer there. And so our communities, many of our communities, are facing this exact same situation. In Alaska, 85% of our villages are coastal communities. We're talking about the possibility of many, many, many communities in our area that have to move. Right now, there are 7 that are in imminent danger of moving. 1 community is in the process of moving, and there are another dozen that will follow in the next 5 to 10 years. We are looking at really severe impacts and the loss of our culture, the loss of our lands, the loss of our language and of our people. So I wanted to just show you some of the real visual aspects of what we live with every day. This is my hometown in Nome. You can see that the Bering Sea, which I grew up on, is no longer is coming into our front street. They have tried many different solutions to try to keep the waters from coming into our communities. In Nome, we have a huge rock seawall that was built in front of the village, in front of the town. But you can see that rock seawall is now no longer doing the job. In my lifetime, I have seen 5 of these events where our front street has been devastated. We used to call them 200-year storms, and then we started calling them 100-year, then 50-year, and then 10-year. Now they happen almost every year. We can expect this kind of damage. Inuit alone are not alone in experiencing these changes. People across the Arctic are feeling the impacts on their livelihoods and the social fabric of their communities. The Sami in Scandinavia and Russia are struggling to maintain their traditional reindeer herding practices as shifting seasons and conditions make traveling and pasturing more difficult. I was listening to some of my friends in the Russian Far East who told me that they have lost more than 1 million of their reindeer because of climate change issues that are going on now in their communities in the Russian Far East. And let me show you one of the reasons that that is occurring. This is what we call the winter rain ice condition. It's when it gets really warm and then really cold, and it ices over so quickly and so heavily that it leaves this very hard crust that our reindeer cannot break through in order to forage. The food that they need is underneath the snow, the ice and snow, and they're simply not able to get to it, and they are starving. We are seeing more and more of these conditions throughout the Arctic. In Alaska and Russia also, large predators like polar bears and wolves are stressed for food as their animals that make up their traditional diets have also shifted range. We found that the polar bears in some of our communities now are actually beginning to change their diets. That we're seeing some of the polar bear now that are eating terrestrial land animals, where before they used to mostly dine in the ocean, and now they are moving to terrestrial animals. Now, moreover, many of these physical impacts are directly related or connected to those further south and are often particularly threatening to other indigenous peoples around the world. The Greenland ice cap, which we visited last year, is melting at an unprecedented rate and holds enough water to add over 21 feet to global sea level rise. That water is already sinking small island countries and low-lying states. We in the Arctic have formed an alliance with the small island developing states and are now working together so that we can have a stronger voice in what is happening in our communities. People on the coasts are threatened, as are others much higher up. The Altiplano of Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia is home to large numbers of indigenous peoples who could be devastated by the loss of water from their own rapidly melting Andean glaciers. Disease patterns are shifting as well, bringing malaria, dengue fever, avian flu to areas and to people who often have little access to basic health services. I'd like to, if I could, just share a few quotes and a few photos from indigenous people from across the globe. I'll ask my IT guy if he would please start that climate change loop for me. Great. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of the stories that people have told me, but this is to give you just a bit of a picture of what is happening to our indigenous people across the world. It says, I'm very concerned about climate change since I live on a small island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. With the current climate change, what we have suffered from most is the El Niño phenomenon. It has destroyed a large percentage of reef structures due to coral bleaching, which in turn affects tourism and the fish population. After the Great El Niño of 1998, this coral barrier has been structurally weakened and in some instances has collapsed. The barrier is lower and less effective at wave breaking. So now more water with more energy is coming into the lagoon and creating coastal erosion. From our friends in India, climate change has had an adverse effect on water availability in parts of India. Famed as the world's wettest point because of its abundant rainfall, Cherrapunji has been unusually dry. The glaciers in Ladakh, which account for 13% of the Kashmir's land area, are now fast receding. The impacts of these changes, including on agriculture, are already visible in India. From the Caribbean, during the last few decades, the hurricane season has become more extreme in the Dominican Republic. Last year, the Dominican Republic was struck by 2 tropical storms during October and November, with precipitation in some parts of the country exceeding regular monthly levels by as much as 300%. From my friend in Peru, she says, "Dear sister, I send you some photos of my place in Ayacucho, a south-central part of Peru. We have many problems because the water is drying, no food for animals, no water for agriculture or to produce food. In this river were many fish, now no fish. In other parts of the Andes, we have problems of glaciation, like El Puno, and the animals and the children are dying. In Africa, the rains that once fell between March and September have now been reduced to only 3 or 4 times a year in Western Kenya. Subject to drought and famine for the last 2 decades, the vast and arid Turkana district, once a savanna, is now a no-go zone. The water table is sinking and pastoralists have to trek up to 70 kilometers in search of water. Climate change is worsening problems already created by human activity. Irrigation and hydropower schemes have reduced the flows of the Omo and the Turkwell rivers and contributed to the decline of Lake Turkana. This has resulted in the dying of indigenous trees and plants along the river where the Turkana people live. An interesting note from one of the Maasai elders that I met in Anchorage, and also a condition we hadn't considered. He said, climate change to him has really impacted him. Where he used to be able to afford 5 wives, he can now afford only 1. And I will tell you that's honestly not a consequence of climate change we had considered before, but to him that was really an important issue, that he did not have the livestock, the agriculture, in order for him to maintain a cultural style and cultural belief that they had in their communities. And most recently, I also heard from a friend of mine from Samoa who lost 11 of his family members in the most recent problems in Samoa. Okay, that's the end. In this age of globalization and our ever-increasing connectivity, we must recognize how the global affects the local and the local affects the global. Let us consider not only the physical but the social impacts of climate change so we can begin to understand and imagine the endless ways that our warming world will affect indigenous communities and indeed all communities around the globe. Arctic indigenous peoples are perhaps uniquely adaptable people. We weathered the storm of modernization remarkably well, going from dog teams and igloos to snow machines, jumbo jets, permanent homes, and even supermarkets, all within a few decades. These enormous changes to our communities were not without consequences. Substance abuse, health problems, the loss of so many of our young people, especially young men, to suicide have been among the saddest results. But through all of this, we have had our land, our predictable environment and climate, and the wisdom that our hunters and elders have gained from it over millennia to help us adapt. Hunting is an integral part of our social fabric. We remain a people of the land, of the ice, and of the snow. Hunting is not just about killing animals. The process of the hunt and eating of our traditional food personifies what it means to be an Inuit. It is on the land that values and age-old wisdom are passed down from generation to generation. The hunting teaches our young to be patient, to be courageous, to be bold under pressure, and reflective. They learn to control their impulses, to withstand stress, to have sound judgment, and ultimately the wisdom to carry out a plan and achieve a goal. Let me repeat, our hunting culture is tied to the land. For us, climate change is an enormous social issue. and thus we believe an issue of our right and ability to exist as Indigenous people. This is one of the reasons that I organized and hosted the first ever Indigenous Peoples Global Summit on Climate Change, which took place in Anchorage in April of this year. The summit brought together more than 400 Indigenous people from across the planet to share their stories, their wisdom, their strategies on climate change. The summit declaration, which is called the Anchorage Declaration, and was adopted by the summit participants, will begin the roadmap for Indigenous communities to lead the way in climate change. The declaration will be presented to the UNFCCC COP in Copenhagen in December and promote the coming together of not only Indigenous people worldwide, but we hope of nations worldwide. As that change begins, new policies must put the Indigenous and other vulnerable regions of the world on a path away from perpetual reaction to environmental crisis and towards sustainable human development. Indigenous wisdom has its place and strength in guiding and influencing a world that has largely lost its perspective on balanced human development and sustainability. We should look again to that wisdom to guide us through this great crisis and to steer us towards a new human-centered sustainability. As our various governments, international organizations, and development programs seek to help Indigenous peoples respond and adapt to climate change, we must work to genuinely empower Indigenous and other marginalized communities. Now, in this great struggle with climate change, must we find solutions that end the cycle of victimhood for Indigenous and other vulnerable peoples of the world. The healthy and productive spirit of people is the basis for all successful human development. Every level in every system, whether institution or government, science or religion, must be directed to ensuring that thriving human communities form the basis for a future of hope and long-term sustainability. This change will require organizations to think deeply on all facets of their programs and operations. They will have to design new types of human and community development arrangements, drawing on the best that the world has to offer, and at all times including and respecting the voices of those who have struggled to maintain their way of life and livelihoods. Climate change profoundly challenges our simple-minded notion that unrestrained economic growth can cure social ills and lead the way to a better world. There is precious little time for us to recenter development on humanity, not only industry, before we fundamentally change our world, particularly for Indigenous peoples and others who contribute least to the problem but have the most to lose. Let us all work together to come to common ground in dealing with this daunting task and move forward together as a human community. Thank you, my brothers and sisters. Kuena.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for those moving, powerful words.